Our first presenters are Alicia Deal and Andrew Waite. So Dr. Alicia Deal is a drinking water specialist with a master's and PhD in drinking water treatment. Starting in 1997, she worked for the TCEQ in various compliance and assistance roles. Since retiring in 2016, she's been a contractor with the Texas Optimization Program. Andrew Waite is a contractor with UTA, working for TCEQ in the TOPS program. Andy has worked for the EPA in drinking water section, administrating drinking water rules for 26 years. He administered the disinfection byproduct rule for Oklahoma until they obtained primacy and was the rule manager for the revised total coliform rule. Andy also has years of experience doing sanitary surveys and optimization work for states and tribes. Please welcome Alicia Deal and Andy Waite.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here. Obviously, we're here for chloramine management. If you're going to go for something else, you should run away now. What we're going to talk about is a little bit about the background and the histories, some of the pros and cons of chloramines, a little bit about the chemistry. We're going to spend a fair amount of time on the breakpoint curve because we think that's real important to be able to understand what's actually going on with chemistry in the water, in your water system. We'll also talk about sample collection and analysis, because if you're not doing that right, then you're making wrong decisions, and it can be a little bit tricky, and you want to make sure that you're collecting the right kinds of samples and doing the right kinds of tests to make sure you actually understand where your treatment's at. We'll talk about sites and schedules, because it's really important to make sure that, in fact, if you are sampling out in the distribution system, that you're getting something that's actually representative so that you can make intelligent choices on what to do next if an issue arises, or to make sure that you guys know that, in fact, that water's as good as it can be. It doesn't cover, this part doesn't cover the nitrification action plan for systems that chlorinate, but we will be doing that next. Okay, so what are they? Chloramines are, in fact, that conjunction of ammonia and chlorine that acts as a really good disinfectant. It has a longer life. Texas requires that every system have chemicals that maintain a residual for disinfection, right? Chlorine, free chlorine is one of the ones that they use, and there's chloramines. And we'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons of those two different chemicals, but we're obviously mostly going to focus on chloramines. The free chlorine family. Free chlorine, it's really that when you're testing for free chlorine, you're really testing both the hypochlorous acid and the hypochlorite ion. Now, the fact is that the method measures both of them, but for disinfectant purposes, it's only the hypochlorous acid that's actually working as a disinfectant, right? So if you're using free chlorine, you want to make sure that you're trying to produce as much of that and as little of the OCl as possible. Now with the chloramines, we have monochloramines, we have dichloramines, we have trichloramines. And when we talk about the chloramines, we're really talking about, because it's the good ones, are the monochloramines. And the analogy, and bear with me, right? It's like you have guests over for Thanksgiving. Monochloramines, they're the ones that show up early. Maybe they bring flowers, a bottle of wine. They have interesting conversation at the end of the day, at the end of the meal. They help you clean up, and then they leave, and, really nice, right? Dichloramines, they show up right before you sit down. They really maybe make a couple of off-color jokes, and they don't clean up, and they probably get some gravy on their shirts. They're not the best ones, right? And then you got the trichloramines, and they show up, and they've already pre-partied, and they're obnoxious. They make a lot of off-color jokes. They probably make a pass at somebody that's inappropriate, and you end up having to kick them out later on because they've fallen asleep on your couch. What we want the monochloramines, that's for sure. A little bit of history of how we came to this place. Well, it's a really useful tool because, as we'll go into it mostly, it's very stable. It stays in the distribution system a long time. The good news and the bad news is it reacts slowly with things, right? So it'll actually kill stuff, but as you know, if you have to do this stuff, you have to have a little bit longer contact time, right? but that also means that it does in fact stay around long. It stays around for weeks as opposed to free chlorine, which is like days. Now, Austin started using it in the 50s. Surface water treatment plants started using it a little bit later because of the surface water treatment rule and the TTHM rule, total trihalomethane rule. And just because because in fact it does react slower with things, right? You don't form those trihalomethanes so quickly, right? And so if you're managing your water age and your distribution system, it's a lot easier to do it with chloramines. And then smaller systems, because now I used to be with the EPA and they were here to help, right? They said now you also have to look at the disinfection byproduct rules. And in fact, it became even more imperative that even with the small systems, that they have a way of managing those disinfection byproduct formations by using something that's not as aggressive in forming them, which is in fact chloramines. It has the benefits of it lasts a long time, it doesn't form the disinfection byproducts as quickly, and it's still a really good disinfectant. Today, most of the surface water treatment plants chloranimate. There may be still a few of them out there. I don't know of any in specific that still use free chlorine, but some do. And most of the purchased water systems actually end up have chloranimation. Some of them have to booster chloranimate, which is another issue, right? But a lot of times, if you have long runs, like in West Texas, chloranimation is really a good way to go rather than free chlorine because, it has that longer persistence. Some groundwater in the Northeast and the Gulf Coast are chloranimated, and part of that may in fact be because they have ammonia in their water, in the raw water. It's naturally occurring. It's not a contaminant. It's just that's the way that water is. And so they're naturally forming the precursors, the ammonia, so that when they add the chlorine, it's a lot easier for them to just go on that chloranimation. But again, I would say that the issue, as we go through all of this, is dosing. You have to make sure what your dosing is so you can figure out what your ratios are so that you're, in fact, making the mono. You want that good guy at the table. You don't want the guy that you have to wake up and throw out at the end of the evening, right? Obviously, the pros is it does have a long-lasting residual, and it is fairly stable on a pretty wide range of pHs. Not really wide, but kind of. Less trihalomethanes, and I talked about this, and haloacidic acids. By golly, I'm really glad that we're only doing THMs and HA5s, because if you think about it, the disinfection byproducts that they found so far, it's like about 700 of them, right? And some of them form really quick, and they disappear really quick, and they devolve into other things. The good news and the bad news, they said, if we're looking at THMs and we're looking at haloacidic acids, we're looking at the main constituents that are out there. It's not that other ones don't exist, but by golly, it's really expensive to try to test for them, and their proportionality and their health effects are really in line with these other ones, which is why we're just testing for these, even though I know that's a pain in the keister to do that. The biggest con that you have for chloranimation is you do have to have a longer contact time, right? Because it's concentration times time, so you're going to have a little bit higher concentration. You're going to have a little bit longer time to get that same disinfectant quality as you would with free chlorine, because it is a slower reactant. And here's probably the biggest one, is you have to worry about nitrification. If you're not tracking what's going on in your distribution system, you can end up having nitrification as a secondary or tertiary issue with not managing your distribution system. And guess why we're here is because there's a little bit more chemistry to learn, right? Chloramine chemistry and the breakpoint curve. How many people have ever looked at breakpoint curve? How many people really like looking at breakpoint curves? Okay, we got one. Yay! Yay! They can be confusing and they can be hard to understand, but they're imperative to understand so that you can figure out what's going on in your water system with your water. It happens a lot of times, right? Things are discovered by accident, not by purpose. That's really the true with chloramines. The wastewater operators wanted to make sure that they weren't putting out water that had a lot of infection viruses and bacteria and stuff like that. And so they're adding free chlorine to the water. And they kept getting confused because, okay, they're putting this in, and it's not doing what they would think would be happening. If you have ammonia in the water, which you have in a lot of wastewater treatment plants, right, as a byproduct, right, when you add the chlorine with the ammonia, it doesn't do what you really think it should do. What you would think would happen is, you add the chlorine and you measure it, by golly, it's the same, right? 1-to-1 ratio. That's what you would think would be happening. Now I'm going to talk just a second about, see that little bitty piece there in the beginning where it's flat and you're adding some? That's just the part where you have just natural demand, whether it's iron or something else. That's not biological. It's just some chemical that's going ahead and reacting with it, and it doesn't. We don't look at that as part of it. We say as soon as it starts going up, but that's what we would look for, what we would expect. But what they found was something weird like that. What the heck is going on? They couldn't figure out what it was. The total chlorine, of course, is on the y-axis, and that's the sum of all the chlorines, right? And the x-axis is, in fact, that ratio of chlorine to ammonia and chlorine, the ClNH3 ratio. And that ratio is really important when you're looking at this, at the breakpoint curve and trying to understand what's going on, because if you just look at it as doses, you might get confused as to what's happening and where you want to be on the in your dosing. It's really fundamental to understand what it is that's happening in your distribution system with your water. The y-axis is the residual, and the total chlorine is the main line. The total chlorine is the sum of all active chlorine species. And so that's going to include the mono, the di, and the trichloramines, your free chlorine. It's all of them. The x-axis is that chlorine to ammonia nitrogen mass ratio. How do they make it? When you add the ammonia and the chlorine to the water, they're going to mix, and you're going to get some chloramation, and you're going to get some extra water. Not enough water that, hey, now I'm making water and I don't have to pump so much. No, it's just, because you're only putting a little bit in. The bar theory of chloramation. So what happens is if you have ammonia in the water, and early in the evening, all of them come in and they're at the bar and they're having a good time. Maybe they're having little talks and they're having fancy drinks with umbrellas on them and stuff like that. Everybody's happy. As the evening progresses, you start getting some of the chlorines show up, right? And as the chlorines show up, they, in fact, hook up with the ammonias, and so you get that chlorination. As it goes on in the evening, more and more of them show up. But at some point, if there's more chlorines that are coming in, you end up with extra chlorines out there, and that's when you start getting the bar fights. That's when we start getting the dis and the tris. Right? That's when we start getting those extra chloramation molecules that we don't want. Breakpoint curve, I want to talk about the different zones. You see there's that first zone I talked about where it's just the demand, the second zone and the third zone and the fourth zone. So that first zone is as you're adding the chlorine, it's going to react really quickly because it's free chlorine still, right? It's reacting really quickly with any of those permanent demand chemicals. Iron, manganese, the hydrogen sulfide, there's some other ones in there. They react really fast, faster than the ammonia. They get completely consumed, and that's just called demand. And every system's going to have a certain amount of demand in their water. And it's important that you have an idea of what that is in your particular water, because when you're figuring out what your dosage is, you have to include that in your determination. And in zone 2, which is what we're going to look at next, what's happening there? Well, as you add more chlorine, right, it's reacting as that first part of the bar scene, right, or the second part of the bar scene, where you're getting some of the chlorines reacting with some of the ammonia and to form the monochloramine. This is the stuff that you want. This is the zone that you want to be in. And I want you to notice on the bottom there, we've done that mass ratio, and you see that they're 5-to-1, right? 5-to-1 chlorine to the ammonia. You want to make sure that you're in that zone. The thing that you want to make sure is that you're not at that tricky point where it's really far up towards the right or way down low towards the left. You'll notice there's also that little gray line where it talks about the free ammonia. The free ammonia, if you need to be measuring that also so you can see what's happening, because you want to make sure that, in fact, although you've calculated it, right? For me, it's the thing is you measure, and then you calculate, and then you add your dose, and then you measure against. It's kind of like what they used to do in the what was they said trust but verify. That's what you need to do when you're doing chlorination. You can trust your calculations, but you need to verify that it's actually doing what you think it's going to do, right? And in the third zone, what starts happening is you'll notice that on the bottom, I want you to notice that there's no more ammonia. And so this is where they're starting to fight in the bar. And you're starting to get the dichloramines and the trichloramines. And the thing with those is they form and they decay pretty rapidly, right? So the good news and the bad news is they're not there a lot. But the bad news is that means that you're really losing any disinfectant from the monochloramine because they're being consumed in this di and the tri, and the di and the tri is then devolving into stuff that's not going to do you any good at all, off-gassing. It is very unstable. Again, no ammonia present. And I guess the other thing that if we talked about it earlier, you know, the second two guests at Thanksgiving, you know, sometimes they have a little BO too. So I got to let you know that these are the dyes and the tris definitely have taste and odor issues, even though they're around for a short period of time. If you're starting to get taste and odor issues, oh, it tastes like chlorine or it smells bad or stuff like that, it's probably because you're in that wrong zone and there's some of that being formed and decomposing over time. Now, this is what, if you're doing free chlorine, this is where you'd want to be operating. You'd want to be operating all the way over here where it's free chlorine. And again, one of the places that, again, and if you're using free chlorine, if you're way down towards the left-hand side of this, right, where you just have a little bit of residual, you might be having some of that dyes and tris. And so, again, you'll be having those taste and odor issues, right? I want to tell you that the taste and odor thresholds for dyes and tris is really, really, really small. I mean, like parts of a part, right? Tenths and hundredths of a part. But for free chlorine, surprisingly, free chlorine taste and odor threshold is like 20 parts. So if they're smelling and tasting chlorine, by golly, it's not because there's too much free chlorine. You don't want to reduce your dosage. That's not the answer, but that's not what we're talking about. Chloramine effective sampling. What do we need to measure? I don't know. Alicia, what do we talk about?
Thanks, Andy. So, you know, monitoring is key. Like Andy said, you got to know what you got before you can make decisions. And, you know, we said that knowing this chemistry is kind of the one con for using chloramines. Well, the other thing is monitoring more stuff. When we measure free chlorine, we're measuring two things, right? Hypochlorous acid, hypochlorite ion. When we measure total, we're looking at this whole slew of stuff, right? All of those 2 members of the free chlorine family and then the 3 members of the chloramine family. So total chlorine is actually telling us this rough guess of 5 things all at the same time. And when we do this, by the way, we're looking at it as Cl2. That's what our instrument, our DR or SL, whatever it is you're using, is going to tell us that this number is as chlorine. And so when we think about that breakpoint curve as just that total chlorine curve, we're kind of needing to interpret that and break it up into those 5 chemicals. So when we look at the monochloramine, the stuff we want, right, the one that brings the side dish to Thanksgiving, that happens in that first chunk, right? And then we get this dichloramine forming when the fights break out. And after we've got some dichloramine, we can get that horrible trichloramine. And like Andy said, this stuff stinks like crazy. It's a medicine-y smell. It happens like if you get a little pocket, if you're doing a free chlorine conversion, even if you're not dosing, you can have areas in the system where you get this stinky chlorinous smell. And then, of course, once all those fights are over, all we've got left is the free chlorine. Well, that would be great, but then we've got the risk of the trihalmethanes again, which is what we were trying to avoid by having chloramines in the first place. And so when we add all of those things up, that's when we get the total chlorine curve. So let me ask you, what do we have to measure to know whether we've got good, strong chloramines in zone, in this case 1, we have no demand, or we have something else? So we can't measure ditrichloroamine. Like Andy said, those things go away so fast. They just are there for a second, stink up the joint, and then take off. And so we only can measure total chlorine, monochloramine, free chlorine, and ammonia. So if I tell you that I've got total chlorine, okay, that's the only thing I measured, and I got a 1.5 milligrams per liter, okay? On the y-axis, I got my total chlorine, that white line up there, that's total chlorine. I've got 1.5. So let me ask you, am I in the first, second, or third part of the breakpoint curve? I heard a don't know out there. I run that line across, right? 1.5 milligrams per liter. I could be in 3 different places. I could have a total chlorine that's made up of mono or di-and-tri or free. So what are we going to do? Well, as always, we take more samples, right? So I'm going to take monochloramine. I'm going to tell you I got a 1.2 for monochloramine. So does that fix it? Can I now tell if I'm in the first, second, or third part of that curve? Maybe not quite. I've narrowed things down a little bit. I know that I'm not over here in the free chlorine zone now, but it could be that I've got the monochloramine, or it could be that I'm off in that di- and trichloramine zone. So what am I going to do? Same thing, right? Take more measurements. So I'm going to add free ammonia to my measurements, and now I'm going to tell you I got 0.3 for free ammonia. Can you tell me, am I in the first, second, or third part of that breakpoint curve? There you go. Good answer. I've eliminated the confusion. I know because I've got that free ammonia going, I know that we're in the monochloramine zone, and that's where we wanted to be, right? We didn't want to mess around with that stinky di-and-tri. So what do you need to measure, right, out of total mono, dichloramine, trichloramine, free chlorine, and ammonia? What we need to measure is total mono and ammonia to know that we've got that good mono. We don't really need to measure the free chlorine, and here's the thing about that. If you've got water that has monochloramine in it, and you measure free chlorine using the DPD, the pink test, right? That thing has interferences with monochloramine. So you can read free chlorine in that monochloramine zone and get a false positive. So sometimes that'll throw you off a little bit. So just be aware of that. And so when we talk about doing chloramine effectiveness sampling, that's what we're talking about. Now let's talk a little bit more about that analysis. Let me ask you out there, how many of you use, first of all, do you all have to deal with chloramines? That's why you're here? Yeah, or I never raise my hand for any question. No. So do y'all have DR 300 or 900? With the DR 300 and 900, you've got that cylinder that you can actually see. How many of y'all have gone to the SL 1000? Yeah, a lot quicker, but you don't have that visual representation. So a lot of times I'll call that DPD test, and that's the one that we've been using for, decades. Call that the pink test. And then the one for monochloramine and ammonia is the indophenol method, and I call that the green test. When we're monitoring out there, we need to be real careful. And it's just like Andy's going to talk about coliform sampling later with the results of the test he did. It's like we have to be extra careful because we're battered about by winds and rain and all this stuff when you're sampling. So we have to take extra care and use a consistent and technically sound method. You want to have your instruments, clean. The cells not like where you can actually see through the cell, that's a good thing. And keep that stuff up to date. Maybe, if those cells are starting to get kind of muddy looking, maybe treat yourself, buy yourself a new set of sample cells for Christmas. not so much of a problem with the SL1000. Follow the method. If you were taught by somebody that had been doing it that way for their whole 50-year career, you might want to trust but verify and go ahead and go back and just check through that method and make sure, like for total chlorine, you're using the low range if you've got a low amount of chlorine, and the mid-range if you've got more like 3 or 4 milligrams per liter. And if you can, take along a little bit of distilled water from whatever Dollar Tree or something, and besides rinsing those cells with your sample water, which might have a little calcium, a little something that's going to tint that cell after a while, go ahead and rinse that with some distilled water after you're done for the day or something, just to keep those cells good for as long as possible, because they're not super cheap. Before you get that sample, how long do you all flush that tap? 0, 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute? Ideally, what you're going to do is clear that sample line, right? Because that sample line that you're sampling from, it could have been sitting in there stagnant for a while. So like when you do your dead end main flushing and you're measuring that residual at first, it could be a 0 out there. But that's just because a little slug of water has been decaying. So you want to clear that and then get your sample. So you do want to flush. What you don't want to do necessarily is flush your sample tap for so long that you're representing water way ahead or way down the line. So if you've got a hydrant you're sampling from and you're flowing 1,000 gallons a minute, you leave that on for a half hour, it's telling you what's happening, several blocks away instead of what's happening right here. So I personally, I would never like anything less than 3 minutes for coliform or for disinfectant residual. And at a rural connection where maybe you got a hose bib on a house with a 3/4 run into there, maybe give yourself, 5 or 10 minutes, long enough to watch a song on your YouTube. I used to say long enough to smoke a cigarette, but that's kind of over. And then, one thing that we have trouble with is ammonia. Ammonia tops out at 0.55, 0.6 on any of your methods, okay? On your DR300, DR900, SL1000, right? And so if you're hitting that 0.55 flashing mark, you want to think about, well, at that point, I don't know what's going on, and I want to know what's going on. So go ahead, you've got that distilled water that you were going to use to rinse out your sample cells after you're done with your sample run. Take just a cup of your sample water and the same volume, a cup of your distilled water, which has nothing in it, right? There's no chlorine, there's no nothing in that distilled water. Mix those together, shake them up, and now you've got a half-strength solution, right? So when you put that in your instrument, you're going to be measuring some number that's closer to under 0.55. So now, first time you do it, it was flashing 0.55. Now you do that 1-to-1 dilution, you measure it again. Let's say you get a 0.4 milligrams per liter on that. What's the true concentration of your ammonia? 0.8, right? It's just 2 times. That's math we can't even fear, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit about sites and schedules since we're talking about monitoring. We've got the regulatory sampling, and then we've got process management sampling. Now, you've got to do both of them, but the results from total chlorine are the only ones that are used for regulatory limit. What's the lower limit for chloramines? 0.5, man. What's the lower limit for free chlorine? 0.2, which speaks to how chloramines last longer, but they have to get in there deeper so that you need a little higher level. The process management sampling that we're talking about is sampling that you are doing just to figure out what's going on. In the coliform world, we might call those special samples. But it's sampling here that you have to do, the mono and ammonia, right? The monochloramine and ammonia. You've got to do it, but there's no regulatory levels associated with it. Not EPA, TCQ is not saying, thou must have some lower limit, some upper limit. It's just for you to be able to identify, is something going wrong or is everything going right? So when we look at the rule, and I know this is small and hard to read, but basically what it comes down to is everywhere we go, we're looking at a minimum sampling requirement of weekly, okay? Now, when we made this rule, are any two public water systems the same? Yeah, no, not even. Not anymore, maybe less the same than people that you meet. And so we had to make it reasonable for small systems and large systems. A large system is doing daily total chlorine for compliance, right? Over 250 connections or 750 people, right? So if I was running a system, I'd probably be looking at my chloramines on that kind of frequency because there's just more moving parts, right? There's more possibilities for something to go wrong, so I want to know more about what's going on. But the minimum is weekly sampling at entry points, so anytime, like if you're purchasing water, it's surprising, but sometimes, you're either sampling at a first customer that's a pretty long way from where your purchase point is. You kind of want to know what you're buying, right? Like you don't leave the hamburger in the car for a day before you try it and see if you like that hamburger. You kind of want to know what it's like right when you get it, and just for your own knowledge. And so I really highly recommend looking at that entry point water, plus it's the rule. And then in distribution system, we do want the total daily, but we say, okay, weekly for mono and ammonia. But again, I would recommend more frequently, especially if you've got a big, like dispersed distribution system that where you can't say the water in the west side is the same as the water in the east side. You want to take your monochloramine and ammonia if you've got a booster treatment plant before and in between the ammonia and chlorine, and then after. Likewise, at a actual treatment plant, like a surface water treatment plant or a groundwater treatment plant, if you can initiate that sampling, it'd be great. I know this rule went in 2015. Most of y'all have, if you have a plant, you've got a plant that went in before 2015, right? So you might not have the footprint or a pipe area big enough for that sample tap, but get creative, try and think of a way to do that. It's going to help you in your dosing. Then the last line on this is nitrate and nitrite. And I want to say the most important thing there is if things are going wrong, and we'll talk about it in the next talk, you're going to want to know what your nitrate and nitrite is. So in addition to your routine sampling, you may want to be able to do responsive sampling. It's actually required. One more point, in the middle column on the distribution system, there's no specific for how many sample sites you have to have, but you have to have samples representative of the distribution system. What other rule uses that term, representative of the distribution system? Total coliform, right? You have to have coliform sites representative of the distribution system. So think about that when you're selecting sites and make sure you've got them covered, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. One of the things about either purchased or raw surface or raw groundwater is that it may have ammonia in it already. Now, if you're real lucky, you can use that as free ammonia from the water and not have to purchase as much ammonia to make your chloramines. So it's a really good thing to at least get an idea of what that looks like, right? Then the treatment before and after dosing. And then finally, that site's representative, and that's kind of a fuzzy word, but if you've got a place that's always biting you in the ankle, you might want to spend a little time sampling out there so that you get on top of it instead of it getting on top of you. So in distribution, we talk about critical control points, and this is a concept that comes from the food industry, and it's anywhere where the water quality changes or where you can get critical data. So in the food industry, it might be when you're making ice cream and you add the sugar, right? It's going to be a certain sweetness after that. For us, it might be plants, of course, but it might also be tanks where the water quality really changes. So source water is going to be a critical control point because that's what you've got, whether it's groundwater, surface water, or purchased water. Plants, obviously, we're specifically making an attempt to change the water quality there, so that's a critical control point. Entry points, again, that's as good as it's ever going to be once you get that out there. And in the distribution system, think about those tanks again, because you're adding all this water age. If you saw Jack talk about water age yesterday, he spent a lot of time on tanks, because that's just a big wide spot in the pipe where you can be adding a ton of water age. Any high-risk, high-water age sites might be critical to you, because that's where you're going to lose your residual first and where that might put you over the edge of where you want to be. And if you have multiple pressure planes, all pressure planes. You know, you can get nitrification happening in a bloom. So let me throw up an example of a system that's picked a lot of sites to represent the north, the south, the east, and the west of their whole system. So the take-home message here, chloramines are a great tool. They last a lot longer. They actually penetrate biofilms really well, even better than free chlorine does. So you're actually keeping your pipes a little bit cleaner with the chloramines, and most importantly, they don't form these disinfection byproducts that, has anybody ever had to notify for THMs or something? When you do, it says it's potentially carcinogenic, right? You don't like those calls you get, do you? Yeah, that's really painful. So they're a great tool. They help you meet those maximum contaminant levels and, keep a residual through your whole system. But monitoring and understanding the chemistry is key to doing a great job of chloraminating. Total mono and that key one, ammonia. Thank you so much.